There's nothing quite like the hollow feeling in your chest when everything you've worked for disappears overnight. For Silas McCrae, a mountain man who'd spent 20 years building a life from nothing in the Colorado wilderness, that feeling hit hard when he woke to find every single one of his animals gone. No tracks, no signs of struggle, just empty pens and an eerie silence that settled over his land like a burial shroud. When he rides into town demanding answers, the wealthiest woman in the valley laughs right in his face. But Catherine Whitmore's laughter dies when she realizes what she has to tell him. What could make a proud widow stop smiling and a hardened frontiersman question everything he thought he knew? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like every other morning for the past 2 decades. Silas McCrae woke before dawn, as he always did, to the familiar sounds of his small homestead coming to life. The chickens should have been clucking softly in their coop, the goats should have been bleating for their morning feed. His 2 horses should have been nickering from the corral, and somewhere in the distance his small herd of cattle should have been moving through the grass with that particular rustling sound he'd grown to love. Instead, he woke to silence. At first, he thought perhaps he'd overslept, though the grey light filtering through his cabin's single window suggested otherwise. Silas pushed himself up from the narrow bed he'd built himself his first winter here, his joints protesting slightly. He was 52 now, though the mountains had a way of making a man feel both older and younger than his years. Older in the body, perhaps, but younger in spirit than he'd felt in the city. He pulled on his worn pants and the flannel shirt that hung from a peg by the door, then reached for the hand-carved walking stick that leaned against the wall. He'd made it during that first brutal winter when he'd thought he might not survive until spring. The gnarled pine had kept him company through many lonely miles, its weight in his hand a reminder that he'd made something with his own 2 hands, that he'd survived when survival seemed impossible. The cabin door opened with its familiar creak. Silas stepped out onto the porch he'd added in year 3, when he'd finally believed he might stay, might make this place a real home. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and morning dew. The sky was beginning to lighten over the eastern peaks, painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold. But something was wrong. The chicken coop door hung open, swinging slightly in the breeze. The goat pen was empty. The corral where his horses should have been showed nothing but disturbed dirt. Silas felt his chest tighten as he walked down the porch steps, his walking stick tapping against the wooden planks. He moved first to the chicken coop, his weathered hands examining the latch. Not broken, not forced, simply open, as if someone had walked up and released it. Inside, the nesting boxes were empty, the roosting bars bare. Not a single feather remained. The goat pen told the same story. Gate unlatched, not damaged, the water trough still half full from yesterday evening. The small shelter he'd built them stood empty, their feed bucket overturned but not scattered, as if something had bumped it in passing. Silas's heart was hammering now as he made his way to the larger corral. His horses, Juniper and Sage, had been with him for 15 years. He'd bought them as yearlings from a rancher down in the valley, had trained them himself, had trusted them with his life on countless occasions. The corral gate stood wide open. Their hoofprints led away to the northeast, toward town. But they weren't the frantic prints of spooked animals. They were calm, measured, as if the horses had simply decided to take a walk. Beyond the corral, in the larger pasture where he kept his cattle, Silas found more of the same. The fence showed no signs of damage. The gate was open. 20 head of cattle, each one representing years of careful saving and planning, were simply gone. He spent the next 2 hours searching his property, walking the perimeter, looking for any sign of what had happened. There were tracks, yes, but they all led in the same direction, toward the northeast, toward Timber Ridge. And they weren't the tracks of frightened animals being driven by rustlers or spooked by predators. They were calm, orderly, as if his entire homestead's worth of livestock had simply decided to leave. Silas returned to his cabin as the sun cleared the mountains, his mind racing. In 20 years of living alone in these mountains, nothing like this had ever happened. He'd fought off bears and mountain lions. He'd survived winters that would have killed a less prepared man. He'd built this life from nothing, asking nothing from anyone, depending on no one. Now, in a single night, it had all disappeared. He sat on his porch step, the walking stick across his knees, and allowed himself a moment of something he rarely permitted: memory. He'd come to these mountains to escape memory, to leave behind a past that had become unbearable. His daughter, Sarah's face flickered through his mind, laughing, always laughing, until that day when the laughter stopped forever. The accident that took her had been his fault, or so he'd convinced himself. He'd been working late at the newspaper, where he'd been an investigative reporter, chasing a story about municipal corruption. His wife had called, asking him to pick up Sarah from her music lesson. He'd said he'd be there in an hour. But the hour had stretched to 2, then 3. Sarah had decided to walk home. She'd never made it. His wife Ellen had left 6 months later, not with anger, but with a quiet grief that was somehow worse. "I can't look at you without seeing her," she'd said. "I can't heal while I'm drowning." So Silas had drowned alone instead, first in whiskey, then in silence. He'd sold everything, taken what little remained, and headed west. He'd found this valley, this mountain, this particular spot where a natural spring provided water year-round. He'd built his cabin log by log. He'd acquired his animals one by one, each purchase representing a small victory over the emptiness inside him. They weren't just livestock. They were his companions, his purpose, his proof that he could still nurture something, still keep something alive. And now they were gone. Silas stood, his decision made. Timber Ridge was a half-day's ride, a town he visited perhaps twice a year for supplies he couldn't make or grow himself. The townspeople knew him as the strange mountain man, the hermit who lived up beyond the timberline. They didn't know his past, and he'd never offered it. But someone in that town knew what had happened to his animals, and he would find out who. He went inside and gathered what he'd need: his saddlebag, his canteen, some dried meat and hardtack, his rifle, though he hoped he wouldn't need it, and tucked in his coat pocket, though he wasn't sure why, the photograph he'd carried for 20 years, Ellen and Sarah, taken the summer before everything fell apart. He never looked at it, but he always carried it, a penance he couldn't quite explain. The walk to town would take him 6 hours on foot, 6 hours to replay the morning's discovery, 6 hours to wonder what he'd find when he got there, 6 hours to prepare himself for the fact that the life he'd built, the sanctuary he'd created, might be gone forever. As Silas McCrae set out down the mountain trail, the sun climbing higher in the sky, he didn't know that this journey would lead him to far more than missing animals. He didn't know that the wealthiest woman in Timber Ridge was waiting for him with a truth that would upend everything he thought he knew about his land, his neighbors, and the past he thought he'd left behind. All he knew was that hollow feeling in his chest, and the grim determination that had kept him alive through 20 years of isolation. Whatever had happened, whoever was responsible, he would find answers, even if those answers destroyed the fragile peace he'd built in these mountains. The trail down from Silas's mountain homestead wound through stands of pine and aspen, crossing shallow creeks and skirting rocky outcroppings that had stood for millennia. Normally, Silas found peace in this walk, in the rhythm of his boots on stone and soil, in the way the forest opened and closed around him like a living thing. Today, each step felt like walking towards something he couldn't name, something that made his stomach tight with apprehension. By the time he reached the valley floor, the sun was high overhead. The landscape changed here, from dense forest to rolling grassland dotted with cottonwoods. In the distance, he could see the buildings of Timber Ridge, small and neat against the backdrop of the mountains. Smoke rose from chimneys. The church steeple pointed toward heaven like an accusing finger. Silas had never felt comfortable in Timber Ridge. It was a town that had grown prosperous in the decade since he'd first passed through it, fed by the railroad that had pushed through 5 years back. Money had come with the railroad, and with money came the kind of people who valued appearances and social standing. Mountain hermits didn't rank high in that hierarchy. He entered town from the East Road, immediately aware of the stairs. A woman sweeping her porch stopped mid-stroke to watch him pass. 2 men outside the blacksmith's shop ceased their conversation, their eyes following his progress down Main Street. Silas ignored them, his jaw set, his walking stick tapping a steady rhythm on the packed dirt road. The general store stood at the corner of Main and First, a 2-story building with glass windows that still seemed like an extravagance to Silas. He pushed through the door, a small bell announcing his arrival. Porter Green, the store's owner, looked up from his ledger. His expression flickered through surprise, curiosity, and something that might have been discomfort before settling on a professionally neutral smile. "Mr. McCrae, haven't seen you since. When was it? March?" "My animals are gone," Silas said without preamble. "All of them. Disappeared overnight." Porter set down his pen carefully. "Gone? You mean stolen?" "I mean gone. No signs of theft, no broken fences. They just vanished." "Well, that's peculiar." Porter glanced toward the back of the store, where his wife was organizing canned goods. "Martha, you hear anything about missing livestock?" Martha Green emerged from behind a shelf, wiping her hands on her apron. She was a thin woman with sharp eyes that missed very little. "Missing from where?" "My place," Silas said. "Every chicken, goat, horse, and cow gone by morning." Something passed across Martha's face, quick as a shadow. She looked at her husband, then back at Silas. "You might want to talk to the sheriff. I'm talking to you first. You hear everything that happens in this town." "Not everything," Martha said, but her tone suggested otherwise. "Did they wander off?" Porter offered. "Animals do that sometimes. 20 head of cattle, 2 horses, a dozen chickens, and 4 goats all decided to wander off at the same time, in the same direction." Silas felt his frustration building. "Someone knows something." Porter and Martha exchanged another look, one of those married couple communications that needed no words. Finally, Porter spoke. "You should talk to Mrs. Whitmore." "Catherine Whitmore? Why would the richest woman in the valley know anything about my livestock?" "Just a suggestion," Porter said, his eyes sliding away. "She owns a lot of land around these parts. Maybe they wandered onto her property." Silas studied the man's face, reading the evasion there. "What aren't you telling me?" "Nothing to tell," Martha said quickly. "It's just that Mrs. Whitmore keeps track of things. She'd know if there were strange animals on her land." It wasn't the whole truth, but Silas could see he'd get nothing more from them. He thanked them curtly and left the store, his mind churning. Catherine Whitmore, he knew of her, of course. Everyone in the territory knew of her. She'd been married to Jackson Whitmore, who'd made his fortune in silver before the mines played out. He died 5 years back in what everyone called a tragic riding accident. His widow had inherited everything, the mansion on the hill, the land holdings that stretched across 3 valleys, and a social position that made her the de facto queen of Timber Ridge. Silas had never spoken to her, had never had reason to. What would a woman like that want with his animals? The sheriff's office was 2 doors down from the general store. Silas pushed inside to find Sheriff Tom Hendricks, leaning back in his chair, boots on his desk, reading a month-old newspaper. "McCrae," Hendricks said without looking up, "heard you were in town." "How?" "I've been here 10 minutes. Small town." Now Hendricks did look up, his expression amused. "Word travels fast when the ghost of the mountain comes calling." "My animals are missing." "So I heard." "Seems like a personal problem." Silas felt his temper flare. "It's theft. That's a crime last I checked. Theft requires a thief. You got any evidence of theft? Any witnesses? Any idea who might have taken them? Hendricks swung his boots off the desk and leaned forward. Or did they maybe just wander off because you don't keep your fences maintained? My fences are fine. Uh-huh. Look, McCrae, I've got actual crimes to deal with, actual citizens who pay taxes and contribute to this community. You want to live up in the mountains, away from everyone. That's your choice. But don't come running to town authority when mountain living doesn't work out. Silas's hand tightened on his walking stick. You're saying you won't investigate. I'm saying there's nothing to investigate. Animals wander. It happens. Check with the neighboring properties. Put up some notices. But don't expect me to organize a posse because your chickens flew the coop. Hendricks grinned at his own joke. Silas turned and walked out before he said something he'd regret. The frustration was building into something darker now, a familiar anger he'd spent 20 years trying to bury. The same anger that had consumed him after Sarah died, when he'd lashed out at everyone who tried to help, when he'd burned every bridge he had. He stood on the wooden sidewalk outside the sheriff's office, trying to calm himself. A group of women across the street were pretending not to stare at him. A wagon rolled past, the driver giving him a wide berth. The Whitmore mansion sat on the North Hill, visible from almost anywhere in town. Silas had never paid it much attention before, but now he studied it. 3 stories of white-painted wood, a wraparound porch, manicured gardens that seemed like a rebuke to the wild landscape beyond. Wealth, respectability, power. Everything he'd left behind and never wanted again. But if Catherine Whitmore had answers, he'd swallow his pride and ask. The walk up the hill took 15 minutes. The road was lined with young maples that someone had planted in perfect symmetry. The mansion grew larger with each step, more imposing, more foreign. By the time Silas reached the front gate, he felt like he was entering a different world. He walked up the stone path to the front porch. Before he could knock, the door opened. A middle-aged woman in a black dress and white apron looked him up and down with barely concealed disapproval. "Deliveries are around back," she said. "I'm not delivering. I'm here to see Mrs. Whitmore." "Mrs. Whitmore doesn't receive unannounced visitors. Tell her Silas McCrae is here about his missing animals. Tell her the Greens sent me." The housekeeper's expression shifted slightly. "Wait here." She closed the door in his face. Silas stood on the porch, hat in hand, feeling foolish and angry in equal measure. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. He was about to leave when the door opened again. "Mrs. Whitmore will see you," the housekeeper said, her tone suggesting this was a great condescension. "Wipe your boots." Silas followed her through a foyer that could have fit his entire cabin, down a hallway lined with paintings and photographs, to a sitting room that faced the back gardens. And there, standing by the window with a teacup in her hand, was Catherine Whitmore. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 40, with dark hair pinned up in an elaborate style and a dress that probably cost more than Silas earned in a year. But it was her expression that struck him. Amusement, clear and undisguised. "Mr. McCrae," she said, and then, impossibly, she laughed. "So you finally noticed?" The laughter wasn't cruel, but it hit Silas like a slap. He stood there, dusty and travel-worn, while this elegant woman laughed at his predicament. "You think this is funny?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Catherine's laughter faded as she saw his expression. She set down her teacup, and something shifted in her face. The amusement drained away, replaced by something more complex, almost sad. "Oh," she said softly, "you really don't know." "Don't know what?" She walked to a sideboard and picked up a small silver pocket watch, turning it over in her hands. It was an unconscious gesture, Silas thought, something she did when thinking or worried. "Sit down, Mr. McCrae. This is going to take some explaining." "I don't want to sit. I want to know where my animals are." "Your animals aren't missing, Mr. McCrae." Catherine looked at him directly now, and all trace of amusement was gone. "They're exactly where they're supposed to be." "What the hell does that mean?" It means we need to discuss the truth about your land, about what you've been living on for the past 20 years, about what belongs to whom." She gestured to a chair. "Please, sit down." Against his better judgment, Silas sat, and Catherine Whitmore began to tell him a truth that would change everything. 3 days passed before Silas made his decision. 3 days of tending his animals, walking his land with new eyes, and sleeping fitfully as memories he'd tried to bury clawed their way back to the surface. The photograph had come out of his pocket on the second night. Ellen and Sarah, frozen in a moment of happiness he could barely remember living through. Sarah was 7 in the picture, gap-toothed and grinning, her hand in her mother's. Ellen was smiling too. That particular smile she'd had before. Grief hollowed her out. He'd been a different man then. Silas McCrae, investigative reporter for the Denver Tribune. He'd broken stories about corrupt officials, exposed graft in city contracts, held the powerful accountable. He'd been good at his job. Too good, maybe. Good enough that he'd let it consume him, let it become more important than picking his daughter up from piano lessons. The accident had been quick, the police said. Sarah had stepped into the street without looking. The wagon driver hadn't seen her in time. She'd died before the doctor arrived. Silas had spent the next 6 months trying to find someone to blame. The wagon driver, who'd been sober and following the speed limit. The music teacher, who'd assumed Sarah's father was coming. The city, for not having better streetlights. Anyone but himself. Ellen had tried to forgive him. She'd said it wasn't his fault, that accidents happened, that blame wouldn't bring Sarah back. But every time she looked at him, he'd seen the truth in her eyes. If he'd been there, Sarah would still be alive. So he'd run, sold everything, headed west, found this mountain, built a cabin and told himself he was starting over. But you can't start over by running away. You just carry your guilt to a new location. Now Catherine Whitmore was asking him to stop running, to engage with people again, to trust someone, to build something that required cooperation and faith. The thought terrified him more than any winter storm or mountain lion ever had. But on the 3rd morning, as he watched the sun rise over his land, Catherine's land, he reminded himself Silas made his choice. He would accept the partnership, not because he trusted Catherine completely, but because the alternative was slowly dying alone in these mountains, and he'd been doing that long enough. He saddled Juniper and rode back to Timber Ridge. The town seemed different this time, or maybe Silas was different. He noticed things he'd ignored before. The new construction on the east side, the railroad depot bustling with activity, the signs of a community growing and changing. Timber Ridge was becoming something bigger than the sleepy frontier town he'd first passed through. He tied Juniper outside the Whitmore mansion and knocked. The same disapproving housekeeper answered, but this time she showed him directly to Catherine's study without comment. Catherine was working at her desk, papers spread everywhere. She looked up when he entered, and he saw the hope flash across her face before she schooled it into something more neutral. "Mr. McCrae, I wasn't sure you'd return." "Neither was I." Silas remained standing. "I'll accept your partnership. With conditions." "Name them." "First, we put everything in writing. Legal documents, filed with the territorial office. I don't care about the money as much as I care about the land. I want my claim recognized, whatever that means in practice." "Agreed." "Second, I control what happens on the land itself. You can hire mining engineers, bring in equipment, do whatever needs to be done. But I decide where operations can go, what gets protected, what stays untouched." Catherine considered this. "That's reasonable. You know the land better than anyone." "Third, if this goes wrong, if the money runs out or the deposits aren't as rich as expected or the whole thing collapses, I keep the land, the cabin, the immediate homestead. That's mine, no matter what. I'll need to consult with my attorney, but I think we can arrange that." Catherine stood and extended her hand. "Partner." Silas shook it, her hand small but surprisingly strong in his. "Partner. They spent the next 2 hours drafting an agreement. Catherine sent for her attorney, a precise man named Thornton, who raised his eyebrows at the unusual arrangement but said nothing. By late afternoon, they had a document that satisfied both parties, pending formal legal review. "We'll need to file this quickly," Thornton said, "before word gets out about the mineral deposits." "How long before word gets out?" Silas asked. Thornton and Catherine exchanged a look. "It may already be out," Catherine said quietly. "3 days ago, a surveyor arrived in town, said he was working for a mining consortium out of Denver. He's been asking questions, buying drinks, making friends. Let me guess, he's been asking about the land near my cabin, among other parcels. But yes, that area has come up in conversation." Silas felt the first stirring of unease. "How did they know to look there?" "That's what concerns me," Catherine said. "The geological survey Jackson commissioned was supposed to be confidential, but information has a way of leaking, especially when money is involved." Over the next week, Silas learned just how true that was. He stayed in town, renting a room above the general store, something he'd never done before. It allowed him to observe things he'd missed, living on his mountain. The surveyor Catherine mentioned was named Dalton Webb, a smooth-talking man in his 30s who seemed to know everyone and be trusted by no one. Silas watched him work the saloons, buying rounds, laughing at jokes, casually asking about land ownership and mineral rights. But Webb wasn't alone. A lawyer arrived from Denver, representing something called the Continental Mining Company. Then another surveyor, this one claiming to work independently but asking the same questions as Webb. The sheriff, Hendricks, suddenly seemed to have a lot of private meetings in his office. Silas began to understand what Catherine had meant about feeding frenzies. Word had gotten out somehow, and now the sharks were circling. He started doing what he'd once been good at, investigating. He listened in saloons, struck up conversations with strangers, pieced together fragments of information, and what he learned worried him. The Continental Mining Company wasn't just interested in the land. They were quietly buying up properties around the valley, offering generous prices to anyone who would sell. Most people took the money gratefully. A few held out, and those holdouts reported strange occurrences: fences cut, water supplies mysteriously fouled, accidents that weren't quite accidents. One evening, Silas found himself in the land office, reviewing public records. The clerk, a young man named Timothy, was helpful enough once Silas bought him dinner. "Lot of activity lately," Timothy said, pulling out filing logs. "More claims and transfers in the past month than in the previous year, all connected to Continental Mining, directly or indirectly. They've got shell companies, agents, lawyers working for them. Hard to trace it all back, but if you know what you're looking for." He showed Silas a series of documents, each one filed by different names, but using the same attorney. Silas copied down names, dates, parcel numbers. He was building a picture, though he wasn't sure yet what that picture would show. On his way back to his rented room, he detoured past the sheriff's office. Through the window, he could see Hendricks meeting with Dalton Webb and another man Silas didn't recognize. They were looking at a map spread across the desk. Even from outside, Silas could tell it was a map of his land. He went back to his room and pulled out the worn photograph. Ellen and Sarah smiled up at him from a happier time. He'd failed them through negligence. Through putting his work above his family, he wouldn't fail Catherine the same way. Whatever was happening, whoever Continental Mining was and what they wanted, Silas would find out. He'd spent 20 years running from his past as a reporter. Maybe it was time to remember why he'd been good at it. The discovery came by accident, the way important discoveries often do. Silas had been searching through county records for 3 days, looking for any connection between Continental Mining and the Whitmore property. Timothy, the land office clerk, had proven to be a useful ally. He was young, idealistic, and quietly outraged by what he saw as corruption in his own office. "There's something you should see," Timothy said on the fourth day, pulling Silas into a back room where older records were stored. "I was cross-referencing property transfers like you asked, and I found this." He produced a dusty file box marked Whitmore, J. Private Holdings 1,875 to 1,880. Inside were documents Silas had never seen in the public records, correspondence, survey notes, and most importantly, a series of assayers' reports that Jackson Whitmore had commissioned but never filed publicly. The reports were devastating in their implications. The mineral deposits weren't just significant, they were extraordinary. The copper alone was worth a potential fortune. The silver deposits were even richer than the geological survey had suggested. And the gold those traces Catherine had mentioned weren't traces at all. They were concentrated deposits that could yield thousands of ounces. "This should have been public record," Timothy said. "Why would Jackson keep this hidden?" Silas studied the dates. The most recent assayer's report was dated 3 months before Jackson Whitmore's death, because he knew what would happen if word got out. Every mining company, every speculator, every corrupt official would descend on this valley like locusts. So he kept it secret and died before he could do anything with it. Silas looked up at Timothy. "Can I make copies of these?" "Technically, no. But technically, these documents shouldn't be hidden in the back room either. Let's say I was organizing files and you happened to see them while waiting for other records." Silas spent the next 2 hours carefully transcribing the key information. When he was done, he had proof that the land he'd been living on was worth significantly more than Catherine had told him. The question was whether she'd known and lied, or whether she'd been kept in the dark like everyone else. He got his answer that evening. Silas arrived at the Whitmore mansion unannounced, the copied documents in his saddlebag. The housekeeper tried to turn him away, but Catherine had heard the commotion and appeared at the top of the stairs. "It's all right, Mrs. Davies. Mr. McCrae is welcome any time." She came down the stairs with that unconscious grace that spoke of careful breeding. "You look troubled. What's happened? We need to talk." Privately, in her study, Silas spread the documents across her desk. Catherine's face went pale as she read them. "Where did you get these?" "The county land office." "They were misfiled in a back room." "Misfiled?" Catherine's voice was bitter, or deliberately hidden. "Jackson had a private arrangement with the old land clerk. He paid him to keep certain documents out of public view." "You knew about this?" "I suspected, but I never saw the actual reports." Jackson said. She stopped, her hand going to the pocket watch. "He said the deposits were promising but not confirmed. He said he needed more time, more money, to be certain. I had no idea they were this rich." Silas studied her face, looking for deception. He saw only shock and growing anger. "Someone else knows," he said. "Continental Mining didn't just stumble onto this valley by accident. They have information, probably from these same reports. Copies, maybe. Or someone who saw the originals. The land clerk Jackson paid? He died 2 years ago. But he might have talked before he died, or sold copies, or—" Silas paused as another thought occurred to him. When did Jackson die exactly? 5 years ago. October 17th, 1880. And when did Continental Mining first show interest in this area? Catherine thought for a moment. "I don't know exactly, but I remember seeing their name in the newspaper about 4 years ago. They'd acquired properties over in Silver Valley." Silas pulled out his notes from the past week's investigation. "According to the mining claims I found, Continental filed their first claim in this county in December 1880, 2 months after Jackson's death. The implications hung in the air between them." "You're suggesting his death wasn't an accident," Catherine said slowly. "I'm suggesting the timing is suspicious. He dies in a riding accident. 2 months later, a company that shouldn't know anything about mineral deposits in this valley suddenly starts filing claims." And 5 years later, they're pressuring landowners, manipulating the sheriff, and circling your property like they know exactly what's buried there. Catherine sat down heavily. Jackson was an excellent rider. He'd been riding since he was a boy. The idea that he'd be thrown from his horse on a clear day, on familiar ground, it never made sense. But the inquest ruled it accidental. No evidence of foul play. Who conducted the inquest? Sheriff Hendricks. Of course it was. Silas added another note to his growing list of connections. Has anyone from Continental Mining approached you directly? Not Continental specifically, but I've had offers. 3 in the past year, each one slightly more generous than the last. The most recent was last month, $50,000 for everything. The house, the land, all of it. $50,000 was a fortune, more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. But based on the assayer's reports Silas had just read, the mineral deposits alone could be worth 10 times that amount. They're trying to buy you out cheap before you realize what you have. And if I don't sell? Silas thought about the cut fences, the fouled water supplies, the convenient accidents that had befallen other holdouts. Then they'll find other ways to convince you. Catherine stood and walked to the window. Outside, the sun was setting over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. What do? We gather proof, real proof, not just suspicious timing and coincidental events. We find out who's behind Continental Mining, who's working for them locally, and what they're planning. Silas joined her at the window. And we do it quickly, before they realize we're onto them. You sound like a reporter. I was a reporter, a lifetime ago. Silas pulled out the photograph he always carried, showing it to Catherine for the first time. I was good at finding the truth. I just forgot why it mattered. Catherine looked at the photograph, at the smiling woman and child. Your family? My daughter died because I was too busy chasing a story to be there when she needed me. My wife left because I couldn't forgive myself enough to be the husband she deserved. He put the photograph away. I've spent 20 years hiding from that failure. Maybe it's time to put those skills to better use. Thank you, Catherine said quietly, for trusting me with that. Partners should trust each other. Yes, they should. She turned from the window. So, partner, where do we start? They started with the obvious, following the money. If Continental Mining was behind everything, there would be a paper trail. Silas had learned long ago that criminals, no matter how careful, always left traces. It was just a matter of knowing where to look. Timothy at the land office proved invaluable. He provided copies of every claim Continental had filed in the county, every property transfer they'd been involved in, every legal document bearing their name. Silas spread them across the floor of his rented room and began looking for patterns. The pattern, when it emerged, was chilling in its systematic nature. Continental didn't just buy land. They acquired it through a web of shell companies and intermediaries, each purchase seemingly unconnected to the others. But when Silas mapped them out, they formed a perfect circle around the Whitmore property, like a noose slowly tightening. They're boxing you in, he told Catherine when he showed her the map. Every property around yours is now owned by Continental or their proxies. If they can't buy you out, they can control access. Make it impossible for you to mine the deposits, even if you wanted to. Catherine studied the map, her face grave. That explains why the Hendersons sold last month. I thought they were just tired of ranching. But their land was the eastern access to my property. And the Talbot place that sold in April controlled the northern approach. What about the southern route? Silas pointed to a property marked in red. Continental made an offer 3 weeks ago. The owner, a prospector named Jeremiah Cole, turned them down. Then Cole is in danger. Silas nodded. I tried to warn him yesterday. He told me to mind my own business. What they needed was proof that Continental Mining was willing to use violence or intimidation to get what they wanted. But proof required witnesses, and most of the people who'd sold out had left the territory entirely. their generous payouts buying fresh starts elsewhere. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Silas had been cultivating sources in the saloons, buying drinks and listening to gossip. One of those sources was an old prospector named Pike, who'd worked mines throughout Colorado and knew everyone in the business. Pike was drunk more often than sober, but his mind was still sharp when he wanted it to be. "You're asking about Continental," Pike said one evening, his words only slightly slurred. "That's a dangerous question, friend." "I'm a dangerous man when I want to be." Pike laughed, a sound like gravel in a bucket. "No, you're a fool. But I like fools. They're more honest than smart men." He leaned closer, his breath reeking of cheap whiskey. "You want to know about Continental? Talk to Marcus Webb. I know Dalton Webb the surveyor. His brother, older brother, used to work for Continental as an enforcer, got religion and quit, lives up in a shack past Miller's Creek, trying to drink himself into forgiveness." Silas found Marcus Webb 3 days later, after asking around and following increasingly vague directions into the mountains. The shack was more of a lean-to, barely standing, surrounded by empty bottles. Marcus himself looked like he'd aged 20 years in the past 5, his face haggard and his hands shaking. But when Silas mentioned Continental mining, Marcus's eyes cleared. "You want to hear about Continental? Sit down. This might take a while." What Marcus told him over the next 2 hours was worse than Silas had imagined. Continental Mining wasn't just a company. It was an operation run by a consortium of investors who'd made their money through questionable means and had no intention of stopping. They specialized in identifying valuable mineral deposits, acquiring the land through any means necessary, and extracting maximum profit before moving on to the next opportunity. "Jackson Whitmore wasn't thrown from his horse," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "He was murdered. I know because I was there." The words hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. "Tell me everything," Silas said. Marcus took a long drink from his bottle before continuing. Continental had known about the Whitmore deposits for months. They had a source, someone close to Jackson who fed them information. When Jackson refused to sell, they decided to remove the obstacle. "They hired me and 2 others to make it look like an accident." "How?" "We spooked his horse on a narrow trail. Jackson was a good rider, but we knew that trail. There was only one way it could end. He went over the edge, broke his neck. We arranged the body to make it look like he'd fallen naturally." Marcus's hands were shaking harder now. "I've done things I'm not proud of. But that was different. That was murder in cold blood, and I knew it even as I was doing it." "Why didn't you come forward?" "Because I was scared. Because Continental has reach. Because Sheriff Hendricks conducted the inquest, and Hendricks is on their payroll. My testimony would have disappeared, and I'd have disappeared with it." He looked at Silas with desperate eyes. "But I kept insurance. Letters Jackson wrote, correspondences with his attorney about the deposits. I took them from his saddlebag before we staged the accident. Continental doesn't know I have them." "Where are they?" "Hidden. Safe. I'll give them to you, but you have to promise me something." "What?" "That you'll bring them down. Continental, Hendricks, all of them. That Jackson Whitmore's murder won't be for nothing," Silas promised. Marcus led him to a false bottom in the shack's floor. Inside was a leather satchel, weathered and water-stained. When Silas opened it, he found exactly what Marcus had described. Letters in Jackson Whitmore's handwriting, discussing the mineral deposits in detail. Correspondence with attorneys about protecting the land from outside interests, and most damning of all, a letter Jackson had written but never sent, addressed to Catherine. "My dearest Catherine," it began, "if you are reading this, then something has happened to me. I want you to know that the deposits are real, more valuable than I dared tell you. I was protecting you by keeping the details secret, but that protection has made me a target. There are men who would kill for what lies beneath our land. If I am gone, trust no one in Timber Ridge except—" The letter ended there, unfinished. Jackson had never gotten to name the person Catherine should trust. Silas carefully packed the letters back into the satchel. This is evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. This can bring down Continental. Maybe, Marcus said, but you'll need more than a dead man's letters. You'll need witnesses, testimony, proof of current crimes. Can you testify? I can, I will, but my word alone won't be enough. Silas thought about this. What if we could prove Continental is still operating the same way? That they're threatening or harming people right now? Then you'd have a pattern, a conspiracy that spans years. Marcus looked at Silas with something like hope. You think you can do that? I think I have to try. Silas returned to Timber Ridge with the satchel hidden in his coat. He went directly to Catherine's mansion, avoiding the main entrance and using a back door she'd shown him for discretion. In her study, he spread the letters across the desk. Catherine read them with tears streaming down her face. He knew, she whispered. He knew they would kill him, and he did nothing to protect himself. He tried to protect you by keeping you ignorant. He thought if you didn't know the truth, they'd leave you alone. Instead, they just waited for me to grow desperate enough to sell. Silas pulled out the unfinished letter. He was going to tell you to trust someone. Someone in Timber Ridge, he thought, was beyond Continental's reach. Any idea who that might have been? Catherine thought for a long moment. There's only one person Jackson truly trusted outside of family, Judge Morrison. He presided over all of Jackson's mining claims, helped him navigate territorial law. He's retired now, lives on a small ranch east of town. Would he help us? If we can convince him we have evidence, yes. Morrison has a reputation for integrity, but he's also careful. He won't act on accusations alone. We have more than accusations now. We have proof of conspiracy to commit murder. We have a witness willing to testify. And, Silas paused, an idea forming. What if we could get Continental to show their hand? Force them to make a move that proves they're still operating outside the law? How? By letting them think they've won. By making them believe you're ready to sell. Silas met Catherine's eyes. We set a trap, we gather evidence, and we use Jackson's letters as bait to draw out everyone involved in his murder. Catherine looked down at her husband's handwriting, his unfinished warning. It's dangerous. Yes, we could both end up like Jackson. We could. She touched the pocket watch, that unconscious gesture Silas had come to recognize as her way of connecting with her late husband. Jackson spent his life looking for silver and gold in these mountains, but the real treasure was always knowing what you're willing to fight for. She looked up at Silas. I'm willing to fight for justice, for truth, for making sure his death meant something. Then we have a plan, Silas said. Tomorrow you let word slip that you're considering Continental's offer, that you're tired of fighting, ready to sell. We see who comes out of the woodwork, who makes contact, who tries to pressure or threaten you. And while they're focused on me, I'll be gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, building a case that even a corrupt sheriff can't ignore. Catherine extended her hand. Partners. Silas shook it. Partners. Neither of them mentioned that they were about to go to war with people who'd already killed once and wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Some things didn't need saying. The trap was set with careful precision. Catherine, playing her part perfectly, let it slip at the general store that she was reconsidering her position. She looked tired, defeated, exactly what a widow worn down by 5 years of struggling would look like. I'm not sure I can keep fighting, she told Martha Green, loud enough for other shoppers to hear. Maybe it's time to accept reality and move on. Within hours, the word had spread. By evening, Dalton Webb was at her door with a friendly visit to discuss her options. Catherine received him graciously, served him tea, and listened to his pitch about Continental Mining's generous offer. $75,000, Webb said, upping the previous offer. For everything. You could buy a nice house in Denver, live comfortably for the rest of your life. It's tempting, Catherine admitted, and she didn't have to fake the exhaustion in her voice. But I need time to think. A decision this large shouldn't be rushed. Of course, take a week. But I should warn you, Mrs. Whitmore, that Continental's patience isn't infinite. This offer might not be available indefinitely. It was a threat wrapped in courtesy, and they both knew it. While Catherine played her part, Silas was working a different angle. He'd convinced Marcus Webb to take him to the other men who'd been involved in Jackson Whitmore's murder. One had left the territory years ago, but the other, a man named Dutch Kearney, was working at a ranch 30 miles south. Silas rode out before dawn, reaching the ranch by mid-morning. Dutch was in the barn, shoeing horses. He was a big man, hard-faced, with hands that looked like they could break bones without effort. "I don't know you," Dutch said when Silas introduced himself. "But you knew Jackson Whitmore." Dutch's hands stilled on the horseshoe. "That was a long time ago. 5 years. Not that long." Silas pulled out a copy of one of Jackson's letters. "I know what happened on that trail. Marcus told me everything. Marcus is a drunk. Marcus is a witness. And he's willing to testify." Silas watched Dutch's face carefully. "The question is whether you want to go down with Continental or whether you want a chance to save yourself." "Save myself how?" "Testify. Tell the truth about what Continental ordered you to do. Help us build a case against the people who gave the orders." Dutch set down his tools and walked to the barn door, looking out at the mountains. "You don't understand how this works. Continental doesn't give orders directly. Everything is suggestions, implications, plausible deniability. Even if I testified, I couldn't prove they ordered Jackson's murder. But you could prove they hired you, that they paid you. That would establish a connection and get me killed in the process. Or save your life. Because right now, you're a loose end. Continental has already killed to protect their interests. What makes you think they'll let you live once they don't need you anymore?" Dutch was quiet for a long moment. "Give me time to think about it." "We don't have much time. Catherine Whitmore is pretending to negotiate with them right now. Once they get what they want, anyone who knows the truth becomes expendable." I said I'll think about it. Silas had to be satisfied with that. He rode back to Timber Ridge, his mind working through the next steps. They had Marcus's testimony, possibly Dutch's. They had Jackson's letters, but they still needed something to tie it all together, something that proved Continental was actively engaged in criminal activity right now. The answer came from an unexpected source: Jeremiah Cole, the prospector who'd refused to sell his land. Silas found Cole's body 3 days after Catherine had started her negotiations with Continental. He'd ridden up to Cole's claim to check on the old man and found him at the bottom of a ravine, his neck broken, his claim marker defaced. The sheriff ruled it an accident within an hour of arriving. Old man, bad eyesight, steep terrain, tragedy, but not surprising. But Silas had seen enough crime scenes in his reporting days to know the difference between an accident and a murder. The way Cole's body was positioned, the marks on the ground suggesting a struggle, the fact that Cole's horse was missing but his rifle was lying 20 feet from the body, as if he'd been reaching for it when he fell. Silas took photographs before the sheriff could stop him, a skill he'd learned at the Tribune, and carefully documented everything. He also found something the sheriff either missed or chose to ignore: boot prints that didn't match Cole's worn footwear. Fresh prints, probably made within hours of the death. "You're interfering with an official investigation," Hendricks warned him. "I'm documenting a crime scene. There's a difference." "There's no crime here, McCrae. Just an old fool who couldn't handle mountain living anymore. Like Jackson Whitmore couldn't handle riding anymore." The sheriff's face went hard. "You'd best be careful with accusations like that." "Is that a threat, Sheriff?" "It's advice. Free advice, which is more than you deserve." Hendricks moved closer, his voice dropping. "You're playing a dangerous game. Whatever you think you know, whatever you think you can prove, it won't matter. This territory has laws, but it also has power structures. You're on the wrong side of those structures. Then, I'm in good company. Silas returned to town with his photographs and his notes, his anger barely contained. Cole had been murdered, he was certain of it. Murdered for the same reason Jackson had been. He owned land Continental wanted and refused to sell. Catherine was waiting for him at his rented room, her face pale. I heard about Cole. They killed him. Just like they killed Jackson. Can you prove it? Not in a way that would hold up in Hendrix's court, but I have evidence, photographs, documentation. He spread his materials across the table. The pattern is clear. Anyone who stands in Continental's way ends up dead. We need to go to Judge Morrison now, before they come for us. They rode out that evening, taking back roads to avoid being followed. Judge Morrison's ranch was modest, a working property maintained by a man who'd retired from the bench, but not from honest labor. He met them at the door with a shotgun, but lowered it when he recognized Catherine. Mrs. Whitmore, this is unexpected. We need your help, Judge. It's about Jackson's death. Morrison's expression shifted. Come inside. They spent 3 hours laying out everything they'd learned. The letters Jackson had written, Marcus Webb's testimony, the pattern of Continental's acquisitions, Cole's recent death. Judge Morrison listened without interruption, his weathered face growing graver with each revelation. This is serious, he said when they'd finished. If even half of what you're saying is true, we're talking about conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, corruption of public officials. It's all true, Silas said. I can prove it. The problem is jurisdiction. I'm retired. I have no official authority anymore, and Sheriff Hendrix is on Continental's payroll. Morrison nodded slowly. I suspected as much, but had no proof. What you're describing requires action at the territorial level, the governor's office, possibly even federal marshals. How long would that take? Catherine asked. Weeks, minimum. Maybe months. You'd need to travel to Denver, file formal complaints, wait for investigations. We don't have weeks, Silas said. Continental thinks Catherine is about to sell. Once they realize she's not, they'll act. Morrison stood and walked to his window, looking out at the darkening landscape. There is one option. The territorial governor is scheduled to visit Timber Ridge next week for the railroad dedication ceremony. If you could present your evidence to him directly, in person, with witnesses, would he listen? Governor Walsh is ambitious, but he's not corrupt. If you can prove a pattern of criminal activity, especially one involving murder, he'd have to act. His political future would depend on it. A week, Catherine said. We have to survive a week and keep Continental from realizing what we're planning, and gather any remaining evidence, Silas added. Anything that strengthens our case. Morrison pulled out a ledger. I kept records from Jackson's cases, including notes about properties and mining claims. They're not evidence exactly, but they might help establish timelines and connections. You're welcome to review them. They left Morrison's ranch near midnight, with copies of the judge's records and a plan. Catherine would continue negotiating with Continental, playing for time. Silas would work on documenting everything they knew and tracking down any additional witnesses. But as they rode back toward Timber Ridge, both of them knew the danger had escalated. They'd shown their hand by visiting Morrison, even if they'd tried to be discreet. In a valley where Continental mining seemed to have eyes everywhere, secrets didn't stay secret for long. Are you afraid? Catherine asked as they paused on a ridge overlooking the town. Yes, Silas admitted, but I'm more afraid of doing nothing, of letting them win because we were too scared to fight. Jackson would have appreciated that sentiment. Jackson was a brave man. Jackson was a foolish man who got himself killed. Catherine's voice was sad but clear. Brave and foolish often look the same from a distance. The difference is whether you survive long enough to see the outcome. They rode into Timber Ridge separately, Catherine to her mansion and Silas to his rented room. Neither of them slept well that night. Both of them knew that the next week would determine not just their futures, but whether justice meant anything in a territory where money and power seemed to trump law and decency. In the morning, Silas began the careful work of organizing evidence. He created a ledger, meticulously documenting every claim, every death, every suspicious event connected to continental mining. He wrote out Marcus Webb's testimony in formal legal language. He organized Jackson's letters chronologically, and he prepared a statement of his own, detailing everything he'd learned and witnessed. If something happened to him, the evidence would survive. Catherine, meanwhile, sent word to Dalton Webb that she was ready to discuss terms seriously. The meeting was set for 3 days before the governor's arrival. Enough time to maintain the illusion of negotiation, but not so much time that Continental would grow suspicious of delays. The trap was set. Now they just had to survive long enough to spring it. Silas didn't sleep that night. He stayed at Catherine's mansion, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond the broken window. Catherine had insisted her staff be sent away for their safety, so it was just the two of them in the large house, listening to every creak and settling sound. "They won't come tonight," Catherine said around midnight, bringing him coffee. "They've made their threat. They'll wait to see if we comply." "You seem very certain." "I've been dealing with bullies for 5 years. They always follow the same pattern: threat, escalation, action. We're still in the threat stage." Silas hoped she was right, but he kept the rifle ready anyway. Dawn came without incident. At first light, Silas rode to Judge Morrison's ranch with all the evidence they'd gathered. Jackson's letters, the photographs from Cole's death scene, Marcus Webb's written testimony, the documentation of Continental's pattern of acquisitions. Morrison received it all with grave concern. "This is enough to warrant investigation. The governor arrives tomorrow for the railroad ceremony. Can you arrange a private meeting?" "I can try. But even if I succeed, Walsh won't act immediately. He'll need to consult with territorial prosecutors, possibly federal authorities. Then we need something more immediate, something that forces action right now." Silas thought for a moment. What if we made this public? What if we presented the evidence at the ceremony itself, in front of the whole town? Morrison's eyes widened. "That would be highly irregular and dangerous. You'd be accusing some very powerful people of murder in a public forum, which would make it harder for them to silence us. Hard to make 2 people disappear when they've just accused you in front of hundreds of witnesses. Or it provokes them to act immediately, before you can present any evidence at all. It's a risk either way, but at least this gives us some control over the timing." Morrison considered this, then slowly nodded. "I can arrange for you to speak during the ceremony. I'm part of the organizing committee. But once you start down this path, there's no going back. I've been down paths with no going back before. This one feels worth it." Silas returned to Catherine's mansion to find the situation had deteriorated. Another note had been delivered, this one more explicit. "You have until sundown. Accept our offer or face the consequences. Don't test our patience." Catherine was pacing when he arrived, her usual composure cracking. "They're coming tonight. I can feel it." "Not if we move first," Silas explained Morrison's plan. "Tomorrow at the ceremony, we present everything. In public, in front of the governor, the town, everyone. They'll try to stop us before then, probably. Which is why we don't stay here tonight." They spent the afternoon preparing. Silas made copies of the most crucial documents, hiding them in different locations. One set with Morrison, one with Timothy at the land office, one buried on Catherine's property in a waterproof case. If something happened to them, the evidence would survive. As sundown approached, they left the mansion through the back entrance, taking only what they could carry. Catherine had arranged for them to stay in a room above the church, a place Continental wouldn't think to look because of Catherine's well-known conflicts with the minister over social matters. Father Matthews, the elderly priest, asked no questions. He simply showed them to a small room in the bell tower and promised to deny they were there if anyone asked. Night fell. Silas and Catherine waited in the darkness, listening to the town below. Around 9 o'clock, they heard horses, many horses. Silas moved to the window and saw what he'd feared, a group of riders approaching the Whitmore mansion. "They're going to burn it," Catherine whispered beside him. "We don't know that." But minutes later, flames began to lick from the first-floor windows. The riders had broken in, doused the interior with kerosene, and set it ablaze. Silas watched Catherine's face as her home, her history, her husband's legacy went up in flames. To her credit, she didn't cry. She simply stood there, her jaw set, watching the fire climb higher. "They've made their final move," she said quietly. "Now we make ours." The fire brought out half the town. People formed bucket brigades, trying to save the mansion, but it was too late. By midnight, only the stone foundation remained, everything else consumed by flames. Sheriff Hendricks arrived, made a show of investigating, and declared it an accident. Probably a lamp knocked over. These old houses, they go up like tinder. Silas and Catherine watched from the bell tower, unseen. "Tomorrow," Catherine said. "Tomorrow we tell the truth." "Tomorrow we tell the truth," Silas agreed. They spent the rest of the night preparing their statement, writing out exactly what they would say and in what order. Silas drew on his years as a reporter, structuring the information for maximum impact. Start with Jackson's murder, present the evidence, establish the pattern, name names. By dawn, they had a speech that would either bring down Continental Mining or get them both killed. The railroad dedication ceremony was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon. They had 8 hours to survive until then. At 1 o'clock, Silas and Catherine emerged from the church. Father Matthews blessed them both, though whether it was blessing or last rites, Silas wasn't sure. They walked toward the ceremony grounds together, carrying their evidence, prepared to speak truth to power in front of the whole territory. Whatever happened next, they would face it, standing up. The railroad dedication ceremony drew nearly everyone in Timber Ridge and surrounding areas. A platform had been erected near the depot, decorated with bunting and territorial flags. Governor Walsh stood at the center, flanked by railroad executives and local dignitaries. Sheriff Hendricks was there too, wearing his best uniform, looking pleased with himself. Continental Mining's representatives sat in the front row, confident and comfortable. They didn't see it coming. Judge Morrison introduced Silas as a concerned citizen with information relevant to territorial interests. The introduction was bland enough not to raise alarms, formal enough to be difficult to interrupt. Silas stepped onto the platform with Catherine beside him, and he began to speak. He started with facts. The dates of Jackson Whitmore's death and Jeremiah Cole's death, the pattern of Continental Mining's acquisitions, the manipulation of land records, and the corruption of local officials. He spoke clearly and calmly, letting the evidence speak for itself. The crowd grew silent. Governor Walsh's expression shifted from polite interest to sharp attention. Then Silas produced Jackson's letters. He read passages aloud, Jackson's own words describing the mineral deposits and his fears about Continental's intentions. He presented Marcus Webb's written testimony about the murder. He showed the photographs from Cole's death scene, pointing out the inconsistencies with Sheriff Hendricks's ruling. "These aren't accidents," Silas said, his voice carrying across the crowd. "These are murders committed to acquire land. Murders covered up by officials sworn to uphold the law." Hendricks tried to interrupt. "This is outrageous. I won't stand here and then leave," Governor Walsh said quietly. "But I'll want to speak with you afterward." Reynolds and the other Continental representatives were already moving toward the platform, but territorial marshals brought by the governor as part of his security detail blocked their path. Catherine spoke next. She described 5 years of intimidation, of financial pressure, of watching her neighbors disappear or sell out or die under suspicious circumstances. She spoke about the fire that had destroyed her home just hours earlier, a fire that was no accident. Continental Mining has operated in this territory like a law unto themselves, she said. They've killed, intimidated, and corrupted with impunity. They believed they were untouchable because they had money and power. But money and power mean nothing without justice. The governor asked questions, specific, pointed questions about evidence and testimony. Judge Morrison stepped forward to vouch for the authenticity of the documents. Timothy, from the land office, emboldened by the public setting, confirmed the manipulation of records. And then Marcus Webb himself appeared, sober and terrified but determined. He corroborated everything Silas had said, naming names and describing in detail how Jackson Whitmore's murder had been planned and executed. "I'm guilty," Marcus said, his voice shaking. "I helped kill a good man for money. I've lived with that guilt for 5 years, but I won't stay silent anymore. I won't let them get away with it." The ceremony dissolved into chaos. Governor Walsh called for an immediate investigation. The territorial marshals arrested Sheriff Hendricks on the spot. Reynolds and Dalton Webb tried to leave but were detained for questioning. By evening, the entire leadership of Continental Mining's local operation was in custody. Telegraph messages flew to Denver and Washington, setting in motion investigations that would ultimately unravel the entire conspiracy. 3 months later, autumn painted the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Silas stood on what remained of the Whitmore mansion's foundation, watching Catherine direct the construction of a new house, smaller than the original, more practical, but solidly built. "The foreman says we'll have the roof on before the snow flies," Catherine said, joining him. She was dressed more simply these days, her hair pulled back in a practical bun rather than elaborate styles. She looked younger somehow, freed from the burden of maintaining appearances. "Good. You'll want shelter before winter sets in hard." The partnership had been formalized, the land properly surveyed, the mineral rights legally established. They'd begun mining operations in September, carefully and responsibly, with proper safety measures and fair wages for workers. The deposits were as rich as Jackson's surveys had suggested. Not overnight wealth, but steady income that would support both of them comfortably. More importantly, justice had been served. Continental Mining's executives were facing trial in Denver for conspiracy to commit murder. Sheriff Hendricks had been convicted and sentenced to 20 years. Marcus Webb received a lighter sentence in exchange for his testimony, and Dutch Kearney had come forward voluntarily once Hendricks was arrested. The truth had come out, and it had mattered. "I got a letter from Ellen," Silas said suddenly. It was the first time he'd mentioned his ex-wife to Catherine. She heard about the trial, about what happened here. She wanted to know if I was all right. "What did you tell her?" "That I was better than I'd been in 20 years, that I'd found a purpose again." He pulled out the photograph he always carried, looking at Sarah's smile. "I can't change the past, can't bring her back, but maybe I can honor her memory by doing something that matters." Catherine touched his arm gently. "She'd be proud of you." "Maybe." Silas put the photograph away. "What about you? Any regrets? About burning down my mansion? About going to war with a mining company? About partnering with a hermit mountain man?" Catherine smiled. "Not a single one." They walked through the construction site together, discussing plans and timelines. The mine was producing, the partnership was working, and both of them had found something neither expected: friendship, purpose, and a future that didn't involve running from the past. In the distance, Silas's animals grazed peacefully. His chickens scratched in the dirt. His horses stood in the corral he'd expanded and improved. Everything he'd thought he'd lost had been returned, along with something far more valuable, the knowledge that he wasn't meant to face life alone. "Where are all my animals?" the mountain man had asked, and in answering that simple question, he'd found not just his livestock, but a reason to live again. Sometimes, the things we think we've lost lead us to what we've been searching for all along. As the sun set over the Colorado mountains, Silas McCrae stood beside his partner and friend, watching their shared future take shape, one beam and nail at a time. The hollow feeling in his chest that had driven him to these mountains 20 years ago was gone, replaced by something he'd thought he'd never feel again: hope.